She is the CEO of a $40 million firm, looking at me across a formal dinner table the way no CEO should look at a junior employee. 1 second, before the composure seals it back. I count it. I have been counting everything: 3 signatures placed in the wrong field, a cover story assembled by someone who knew it wouldn't hold, 6 weeks of questions carefully buried inside professional language. Now there are no documents between us, no committee, no polished desk to put distance across. Just her office, afternoon light coming through the floor-to-ceiling glass, and me asking the question she has been managing around for months. She turns from the window. She is not going to manage it anymore. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. Meridian Capital occupies the 31st through 34th floors of a glass tower in the financial district. From the inside, specifically from the 32nd floor where the executive offices live, and the walls are all glass, and the carpet is a gray that cost more per square foot than Bex's first studio apartment. It looks like the kind of place where decisions are made that ripple outward across industries and into lives that have never heard the firm's name. Bex Okafor had worked there for 22 months as a documentation and contracts specialist, which was the kind of title that sounded administrative until you understood what it meant inside an M&A firm at the executive level. It meant she prepared the signature packages. She managed the chain of execution on every major transaction the firm closed. She was the person who ensured that the right signatures landed in the right places on the right days, which in the business of buying and restructuring companies was not a small thing. Documents signed in the wrong place had cost firms and deals and careers before Bex was born. She had made it her business to understand this, to study it, to be meticulous enough that it never cost anything at Meridian on her watch. She was good at her job. She also knew, with the particular self-awareness of someone who had been watching the mechanics of a high-functioning executive organization from the inside for 22 months, that her job was not the only reason she was still thinking about the 32nd floor at 9:30 on Thursday nights. Cora Street James had been the CEO of Meridian Capital for 5 years. Before that, 14 years in M&A law, at a firm that everyone in Bex's industry knew by reputation, making partner at 31 and then moving to the operating side at 34, with the deliberateness of someone who had been heading to a destination all along. She was 39. She wore dark suits, always charcoal, navy, occasionally a deep forest green that looked like intention rather than variation because everything she wore looked like intention. Her hair was dark and she kept it back. And on the rare occasions when it was down the tail end of a very long day, a company retreat 18 months ago, where someone had brought decent wine, it changed the quality of whatever room she walked into. She wore a platinum watch on her right wrist. Old, possibly inherited. It sat against her wrist the way you stop noticing your own heartbeat, except in the moments when someone makes you pay attention to it. Bex had been in close enough proximity to her 12 times over 22 months to note the watch specifically, to understand that it was not standard issue and not recent. It was the kind of object that carried history in its weight. She moved through the building with the economy of someone who had optimized her use of space and time since before most of her employees graduated college. She did not hurry. She did not lag. She arrived where she was going at the precise moment she intended to arrive, and she left conversations and rooms with the same controlled intention. The rare occasions when she appeared unscheduled somewhere, a doorway, a hallway, the documentation floor in the middle of a morning, were the occasions Bex had learned to pay the most attention to. She was the most competent person Bex had ever been in a room with. Not an opinion. An observation built across 22 months of watching someone navigate every situation that came at her with what looked like effortless precision but was, if you watched closely enough, something harder won. It looked effortless because she had done the work to make it look that way. The distinction was something Bex had come to understand only because she had been watching closely enough for long enough. She had been watching closely enough for longer than was strictly professional. She had also been not talking about this to anyone, including herself, with a commitment she thought would expire eventually, but had not expired yet. The Harlan Media acquisition had been in due diligence for 4 months when the final signature package landed on Bex's desk. A Thursday morning in March. The deal was complicated in the way media company deals were always complicated. Layered IP holdings, licensing arrangements drafted by a firm that no longer existed, a balance sheet with a different story than the number at the bottom if you knew which lines to read. The final acquisition agreement required Cora's personal execution on 11 pages, 3 of them flagged by counterparty counsel as requiring signature in a specific field only, with no corrections acceptable without a full amendment process. Standard for a transaction of this size. What was not standard was Cora's request to receive the package directly, rather than through the usual routing. Robbie Chen, Cora's executive assistant, had communicated this when Bex called to arrange the slot. "Miss Street James would like you to bring the package directly," Bex had said. Of course. She had then gone to the restroom and looked at herself in the mirror for about 30 seconds longer than the situation required. She scheduled the delivery for Thursday at 2:15. Cora's calendar showed a gap between the board prep call and the 3 o'clock CFO walkthrough. 10 minutes. More than enough for 11 signatures. Bex had the portfolio prepared by 2, phone on silent. Flagged fields checked 3 times. She wore the blazer, because the 32nd floor was always cold, and she had learned this after the first visit, when she arrived in just a blouse, and spent the meeting with her arms slightly crossed in a way Cora had not commented on but had, Bex was almost certain, noticed. Robbie waved her through at 2:15 exactly. Cora's office occupied the southeast corner floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 walls, a view that extended on clear days past the financial district to the harbor. The furniture was minimal and expensive in the way things are expensive when the cost is in the materials and not the ornamentation. The desk was large and polished and almost entirely clear except for the tablet and a small framed photograph in the far corner that Bex had been close enough to see twice and had never asked about. The office always smelled the same. Paper and conditioned air and something faint underneath cedar, possibly, present only at close range, gone the moment you stepped back. Cora was at the window when Bex came in, profile to the glass, the tablet in her hand, reviewing something. She turned immediately when she heard the door, which was itself a small departure. She usually finished the thought she was working through before acknowledging anyone who entered. Bex crossed to the desk, opened the portfolio, slid the first document across the polished surface with the tab visible. "Page 1, she said. "Signature in the lower right quadrant, date beside it." She looked at the flagged field. Everything was where it should be. Cora set the tablet down, picked up her own pen. She always used her own, and brought it to the page. She did not look at the page. She looked at Bex. Bex was watching the flagged field. She did not register the problem for the first 2 seconds. When she did, the pen was already lifting, and the signature was there. Clean, complete, and precisely 2 centimeters above the correct signature line. She looked at the error, then up at Cora. Cora was looking at her, not at the document, at Bex. Her expression was composed in the way her expressions were always composed, level, unhurried, sealed, but the composition was doing more work than usual, like a door that looked different when you could see it was locked. "I think there may be a placement issue on that one," Bex said. Cora looked at the document, a half second. Then, next page. Bex slid the second document. She pointed to the red tab lower left, below the certifying block. Clear, isolated, nothing nearby that could be mistaken for it. Cora brought the pen to the page. She looked at Bex again. The signature landed in the wrong place. The second wrong in 2 pages, and Cora Street James did not execute things incorrectly twice. Bex said, carefully, "There is a counterparty amendment process." "Page 3, Cora said. She said it without looking at the document she had just incorrectly signed. Bex slid the 3rd page. The flagged field was in the center. Visible. Isolated. The only way to sign in the wrong place on this page was to not be looking at the page at all. Cora looked at Bex for 3 seconds. 4. Then looked down and signed in the wrong place. The office was very quiet, cold the way it was always cold. The view through the glass was doing nothing about the silence. Cora set the pen down. She looked at the document with the expression she would have brought to a brief requiring correction-focused, neutral, processing. Then she said, "There is a correction process. Yes, I will arrange the counterparty amendments. Arrange it." She picked up the tablet, turned her chair toward the window. Bex gathered the documents, put them in the portfolio, and left the office. She was professional about it. Completely professional. She walked past Robbie, who looked at the portfolio with the careful neutrality of someone who had been in executive support long enough to recognize a situation from its shape without needing it named. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Minor corrections needed," Bex said. She went to the elevator. She sat in the coffee bar across the street for 20 minutes with an espresso she barely tasted and the specific logical problem laid out in front of her mind. Cora Straint. James had signed 3 consecutive pages in the wrong place while looking at Bex instead of the documents. She had not made a documentable professional error in 5 years at Meridian and 14 years before that. There was the version of events where this was a coincidence. Bex had assembled coincidences before, in the documentation work, and in other parts of her life, and she knew what they looked like. They had the quality of explanations that fit the facts but required you to ignore the configuration. The 3 pages were not a coincidence. The direction of Cora's gaze was not a coincidence. The cover story about the Hanover brief was the thing that made the configuration impossible to ignore, because the cover story required Bex to believe that a former M&A attorney with 14 years of experience in careful language had produced an explanation she should have known would not hold up under the mildest scrutiny. The only explanation that accounted for all 3 events was the one Bex was not going to write anywhere. She processed the counterparty corrections, told Tamsin there had been placement adjustments required, and went home. She thought about it the way you think about something that is perfectly clear, and also completely impossible the way the mind returns to a logical conclusion it has not decided it is prepared to accept. The corrected pages came through in 48 hours. Bex arranged a second delivery, going on Saturday when the building was quieter. Robbie was not at his desk. Cora's door was open. Bex knocked. Cora looked up from actual paper spread across the desk, and for the first half-second after raising her eyes, she looked like someone who had been very far inside her own head and needed a moment to navigate back. "The corrected signature pages," Bex said. Cora cleared space. Bex laid out the documents with each tab visible. She pointed to each flagged field. Cora signed all 3 correctly on the first attempt, set the pen down, and looked at the documents without immediately looking up. Then she said, without looking at Bex, "I was reviewing the Hanover brief. On Thursday, when I signed the package, I was cross-referencing it simultaneously and was not fully attentive. The Hanover brief had been final for 5 weeks," Bex said. "Of course." She said it without inflection, without giving the cover story anything to push against. She picked up the portfolio, said she would have the corrected pages couriered to counterparty counsel by Monday, and left. In the elevator, she thought about the Hanover brief. She thought about a woman with 14 years in M&A law who had been cross-referencing a filed and settled regulatory document so intently that she had signed 3 consecutive pages in the wrong place. She thought about the locked door that was the composed expression. "The Hanover brief has been final for 5 weeks, she thought. "I know," said the part of her that had been paying close attention since October. The pattern established itself over the next 3 weeks with the quiet persistence of something that had been building for a long time and was only now becoming legible. Cora began requesting Bex specifically for document deliveries. Not all of them routine routing still went through Robbie. But anything Cora flagged as requiring direct review came with a note requesting Bex personally. She signed everything correctly in those meetings. She also asked questions that went slightly beyond what a CEO needed to ask the person who had prepared the documents. Not professional questions, she had counsel for those. Questions about how long a particular section had taken, whether Bex had found the counterparty cooperative, once whether Bex found the current weekend schedule workable, each answered professionally. Each carrying the weight of a second question that neither of them named. Bex had asked Tamsin, meaning to sound casual, whether Cora had historically had document delivery preferences. Tamsin had set down her coffee. She has not, Tamsin said. Before you, she would accept deliveries from any of the documentation team. Before me, Bex said. Tamsin said, and turned back to her work. In the 3 weeks of deliveries, Bex assembled the evidence the way she assembled everything without deciding in advance what it meant. Cora signed correctly. She looked at the documents. She was, in every measurable way, the version of herself Bex had been watching for 22 months. But her composure was costing more than usual at the edges, the jaw more set. The half-second before answers, she did not take in any other conversation. The way she held the pen waiting for documents to be laid out, not clicking it, not moving it, holding it with the specific stillness of someone containing rather than at rest. There was also this. When Bex left, Cora did not immediately return to whatever she had been doing before the meeting. Bex could not have known this from direct observation, but she knew it from the elapsed time between the end of the meeting and Cora's next action, as tracked through the shared calendar and the Robbie-mediated communication that moved between her office and the rest of the firm. There were gaps, small ones, the kind that existed when someone was doing nothing visible, which in Cora's schedule was the kind of anomaly that registered as a data point if you were tracking the data. Bex cataloged all of this without filing it anywhere it could do anything. Not yet. The integration assignment arrived in the 4th week. Bex's manager, Daria Moss, called her in and told her she had been selected for the Harlan Media Integration Committee, a cross-functional group covering documentation, compliance, communications, and executive leadership. Not a role that would typically include someone at Bex's level. The committee chair was the COO. The executive sponsor was Cora. Daria framed it as professional development and recognition of Bex's work on the acquisition documentation. Both true. Bex said, "Thank you. This is a meaningful opportunity." She walked back to her desk and stared at her monitor for about 40 seconds before Tamsin appeared at the partition. "Integration Committee," Tamsin said. "How do you know these things?" Bex said. 6 years, Tamsin said. "There are 2 people on this floor whose documentation work justifies that committee. You and Marcus Yee. Marcus has been here 4 years and has worked more transactions." "Marcus was not selected," Bex said. "No," Tamsin said. "He was not." They sat with that for a moment. Bex said, "It is entirely possible the selection criteria were purely merit-based." "It is entirely possible," Tamsin said, in a tone that suggested she entirely disagreed. She turned back to her work. The first integration committee session was the following Tuesday. The COO opened. The committee worked through the Phase 1 checklist for 45 minutes documentation requirements, submission timelines, the regulatory filings calendar. Cora arrived at the 50-minute mark, coming in without disrupting the room's rhythm, taking the seat at the head of the table. The session continued. She did not look at Bex when she came in. At the 62-minute mark, the COO asked Bex to walk through the documentation timeline for the first phase regulatory submissions. Bex walked through it. She knew the filing sequence, the response windows, the 3 jurisdictions with differing requirements, the one hard deadline that compressed everything on either side of it. She had prepared it with the particular thoroughness of someone performing at a level above their usual audience. When she finished, Cora said, "The window you flagged in week 3, between the initial filing and the response deadline. Is there documentation risk in that gap?" "Yes," Bex said. "I have a mitigation plan. Present it." Bex presented it. Summary version first. Detail on the follow-up question Cora asked, because the follow-up was the natural next question from someone who understood documentation risk at Cora's level. "Good," Cora said. "That's solid work." "Thank you," Bex said. She looked at her notes when she said it, the way she would have if this were any committee. She felt it anyway, the quality of attention that had been in the room for the 6 minutes of her presentation. She looked up when the COO was speaking again, and found Cora already looking away. Presley Malone arrived at Meridian on a Wednesday in the 5th week. She was a consultant from the advisory firm that had handled the Harlan deals buy-side M and A senior associate on the integration support team, partner track energy, dark hair worn loose, warm in the way some people are warm, without calculating what the warmth accomplishes. She was observant the same way, noticing and reflecting things back naturally, without agenda. She found Bex on her second day, in the documentation office, with a question about the file format for integration binders. Bex walked her through it. Presley asked good questions. She thanked Bex genuinely and said, "Is there a good place to get coffee near here that isn't whatever that machine in the break room produces?" 2 blocks left, the place with the green awning, Bex said. "They close at 4:30, but the espresso is worth timing your day around," Presley said. "I like a person who knows their coffee geography." They walked down together at 3:45. The company was easy, the documentation day had been long, and the espresso was, as Bex had said, worth it. They talked about the integration timeline, and then about the advisory firm's approach to the due diligence, and then about the particular texture of moving between firm culture and client culture. 35 minutes. When Bex came back to her desk, Tamsin was looking at her monitor with the expression of someone who was absolutely not paying attention to the direction of the executive offices. Bex said she needed to know the coffee situation. Tamsin said. "How was the espresso?" "The same as always," Bex said. The next morning at the integration pre-session prep, Cora walked through the documentation office. This was not her usual route between her office and the boardroom. She was carrying the tablet and a coffee from somewhere that was not the break room. She did not stop. She looked at the standing group, 3 people, Bex among them with the level attention she would have given any working group, nodded, and continued. At the integration session that afternoon, Cora arrived on time rather than at the 50-minute mark. She ran the second half herself. She was precise and direct, and completely in command of the room, and she did not look at Bex any more than she looked at the 3 other people at the table. Bex had the specific awareness of someone watching a performance being given for one member of the audience, with the understanding that the audience member was expected to pretend she didn't know. On Thursday, a meeting request appeared from Robbie. Wednesday at 3. Documentation review. 32nd floor. Standard phrasing. She accepted it. At 2:15 Wednesday, she rode the elevator to 32. Robbie waved her through. Cora had the integration timeline on the desk with margin notes in her working hand, small and precise, the thinking hand rather than the presentation one. She looked up when Bex came in. "The week 4 submissions," she said. "Walk me through the sequencing." They worked through the week 4 documentation plan for 22 minutes. Real, substantive work. Then Cora said, "The advisory team's file reconciliation. The Malone approach, is it holding?" "So far," Beck said. "She knows the legacy system." Cora looked at the timeline. Her pen was in her hand. She tapped it once against the desk surface. Just once. Controlled. "She has been useful to the documentation process," Cora said. Bex looked at her. There was a specific quality to the sentence. Not the words, the flatness of an assessment being constructed with some care. "She has," Bex said. "Good. Her firm's integration support runs through the quarter. If the reconciliation requires her involvement beyond week 6, the transaction agreement allows for it." "I'll keep that in mind," Bex said. The kind of silence that has something in it settled between them. Cora looked at the timeline. Bex looked at the document in her hands. Outside the glass, the afternoon light was long and gold, in the way March afternoons get when the sky finally clears. Cora said, "Is there anything about the committee process that is not working for you?" "The process is working well," Bex said. "If there were friction, there is no friction. A beat." Bex said, "Is there something you want to ask me directly?" Cora looked up. The composure was fully present and costing more than Bex had ever seen it cost. "What I want to ask," Cora said, "is whether the work is what you expected when I assigned it." "You didn't assign it," Bex said. "Daria made the assignment." A pause. "Daria made the formal assignment," Cora said. Bex held her gaze. There it was. Not covered. Not quite. It is more than I expected, she said. In a good way. Cora said nothing. Bex said, You could just tell me what you're actually asking. The pen was still in Cora's hand. She set it down. Precisely. In the position it had occupied before she picked it up. I am asking, she said, whether the work has been worth your investment. Bex said, The work is excellent. The integration experience will be valuable. The access it provides is useful. Yes, Cora said. All of that is true. Then what are you really asking? Bex said. The afternoon light through the glass was long and gold. The watch caught it once, a small bright thing on Cora's right wrist. Whether you are comfortable here, Cora said. At this level, I am very comfortable, Bex said. Good. She picked up the timeline. The meeting was over in the way her meetings were over when she signaled completion without saying so. Bex gathered her things. She was almost at the door when Cora said, without inflection, The third jurisdiction submission window is the one to watch. I know, Bex said. She left. She went to her desk and thought about whether you are comfortable here and the weight behind it that had nothing to do with the committee. The sentence had been the closest Cora had come to asking something real in 5 weeks of orchestrated proximity, and they both knew it, and neither of them had done anything with the knowing. That was the particular texture of this thing they were in, the acknowledged but unnamed, the question asked sideways and answered sideways, both of them fully fluent in a language neither of them had agreed to use. Tamsin appeared. Weekly status updates directly to the CEO, she said. The only other person I've seen get direct weekly updates from St. James was the CFO during the financial restatement, she continued. And that was because the SEC was involved. The SEC is not involved, Bex said. No, Tamsin said. It is not. She went back to her desk. Bex sent the mitigation plan update directly to Cora. Cora replied in 14 minutes. Approved. Add the timeline adjustment to the committee record. 2 sentences. Bex looked at them longer than 2 sentences warranted. The Tuesday integration session in the 5th week ran long. A procurement question unspooled into a 30-minute subdiscussion that pushed everything past the scheduled end. By the time the room cleared, it was 6:20. The building was in its evening shift reduced occupancy, the cleaning staff working upward through the floors, the particular quiet of a large building that is not empty but is no longer loud. Bex was gathering her materials when she registered that she and Presley were the last 2 people in the room, and then that Presley was looking at her with an expression that was warm and direct and completely clear. I've been meaning to say, Presley said, that the documentation work on this integration is the cleanest I've seen on a deal this size. That's yours. It's a team effort, Bex said. The team does good work. The person who organized the team's approach is you. Bex said thank you, she meant it. Presley said, The green awning place again Thursday? If you have time, I'll check my calendar, Bex said. Presley smiled, said goodnight, left. Bex stood in the conference room for a moment with the lingering ambient scent of coffee and whatever clean soap Presley used. She was thinking about Thursday. She was also, without entirely knowing why, thinking about whether Cora was still on the 32nd floor. She went to the elevator on the executive bank. The door opened. Cora was in the elevator. Not waiting for it. Inside it, coming down from 32, stopped at 31 when Bex pressed the button. Bex stepped in. The elevator was standard executive size, not small, but closed in the specific way elevators are closed. The door shut. The ceiling light was the soft evening setting, warmer than the daytime version, and it did something to the dimensions of the space that the daytime light did not do. Cora was near the back panel. She was in the dark charcoal suit from the session, minus the jacket, sleeves rolled once at the forearm the way they went when she was working past hours. She held the tablet against her chest with one arm and did not appear to be reviewing it. The cedar smell was present. More than at desk distance. At this distance, in this sealed space, it was definite cedar adjacent and clean and specific to her, and Bex had not been this aware of it before. She had been in offices with her, in conference rooms, in hallways. None of those configurations had the closed-door economy of this one. None of them had the particular stillness of shared air in an enclosed space moving from one floor to another. And none of them had made her this aware of the temperature differential between one side of the elevator and the other. Bex pressed 28. Cora had already pressed lobby. They descended in silence. The elevator made the particular sound of executive elevators quieter than the general building lifts, a controlled drop. 30. 29. Bex said. The session ran over. I know. I reviewed the summary. 28. The door opened. Bex stepped forward. She stopped with her hand on the doorframe, not because she needed to stop, but because her body did the thing it did around this woman, which was to find reasons to stay rather than reasons to leave. I'll have the updated compliance review on the third jurisdiction timeline to you by Friday, she said. Cora said, I know you will. Without inflection. Without anything extra. Except what it said was that she had already expected it, had already accounted for it as a certainty, and the certainty was specific to Bex in the way everything Cora accounted for here was specific to Bex. Bex stepped out. The door closed. She stood in the evening corridor for a long moment. The documentation wing was ahead. The building smelled like conditioned air and cleaned surfaces and something cedar adjacent that might have been real or might have been the absence of proximity she had just stepped out of. She noted, privately, that she had registered the scent differently tonight than she had in 12 previous visits to the 32nd floor. The difference was distance. The elevator was the closest she had been. She took the stairs. The closing dinner for the Harlan acquisition was held on a Friday, 3 weeks later, at a private room in a restaurant 3 blocks from Meridian's tower. The deal was fully executed. The integration was in phase 1. The dinner was the kind of event that marks the formal completion of a process, deal, tombstone presentations, photographs, the professional handshake that closes a chapter. Bex had been included because her name appeared on enough of the transaction documentation that counterparty counsel had suggested her presence. She arrived at 7 in a dark dress and a blazer. Presley was near the bar with the advisory firm's senior partner. She found Bex with her eyes across the room and made a small acknowledging gesture. Cora arrived at 7:15 in a dark suit that was different from her work suits, same quality and precision, but the cut was more deliberate, the kind of suit you wear to something that matters rather than something that requires you to be appropriately dressed. She carried nothing. No tablet, no clipboard, no professional object to reach for. She worked the room efficiently, the greetings and brief conversations conducted in her level, competent way. She did not look for Bex when she came in. This was itself information. The tombstone presentation came first, the acrylic deal memorial, photographs with the Harlan executive team, a brief acknowledgement of the transaction's complexity from the COO, and a few measured sentences from Cora that were precise and genuinely warm in the way her warmth always was. Earned, specific, entirely, without performance. She thanked 3 people by name and by function. She did not thank Bex specifically. This was also information, because Bex's name was on more of the transaction documentation than 2 of the 3 people named. And Cora was not a person who made attribution errors. Presley caught Bex's eye across the room during the remarks and made a very small expression, eyebrows slightly elevated, a compressed almost smile that said she had noticed the omission too. Then she returned to the appropriate professional attention. Bex watched her work the room. She watched her talk to the Harlan CFO. She watched her speak briefly with Presley and the advisory firm's senior partner, a quick professional exchange, efficient, Presley's warm manner meeting Cora's cooler one. She watched Cora's eyes do their usual brief circuit of every room she entered, cataloging occupants, and she watched those eyes not land on her. Not publicly. Not where anyone would see. Dinner was served. Bex was seated 3 places from the middle. Cora was at the head. They were not adjacent. They were in direct visual range. Bex ate and talked and performed the professional register these dinners required. She talked through the integration timeline with counterparty counsel. She listened to the Harlan CFO describe the IP valuation process. She was present and calibrated. She also, at 3 points during dinner, looked across the table to find that Cora was already looking back. not obviously, not in a way anyone around them would have tracked. The expression was the professional one. But 3 times, across the white linen expanse of a formal dinner table, their eyes met. And 3 times, Cora was the one who looked away first. The first look, brief, during the Harlan CFO's remarks about the IP valuation timeline, Cora's attention did not stay on Bex long enough to be documented. She looked, registered, looked away. The quality of it was the same as every other look across 22 months of working in the same building, except that Bex knew, now, the difference between a CEO cataloging her floor and a person doing something else entirely. The second look, longer. During the soup course, while Bex was responding to a question from counterparty counsel, she became aware, mid-sentence of attention from the head of the table. She did not look up immediately. When she did, Cora's gaze moved to the window, with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had been thinking about the window the whole time, and had simply gotten there. The third look came when Presley said something that made Bex laugh, a genuine sound, an unguarded one, the kind she produced when something caught her unexpectedly. She looked up from Presley and directly across the table. Cora was looking at her with an expression that was not the professional one, and lasted approximately 1 second before it sealed itself back into composure. 1 second, long enough for Bex to understand that she had not imagined any of this. After the handshake portion, the room emptied over 15 minutes. Tamsin found Bex near the door, heading out. "You coming?" "In a minute," Bex said. "I need to catch counterparty counsel before she leaves." Tamsin said, "Of course you do," and left, because Tamsin had been working with Bex for 22 months and knew exactly what the counterparty's counsel had to do with it. The counterparty's counsel had already left. Bex knew this. She stood near the door and waited for a reason she was not examining. The room emptied. The advisory partners left. Harlan's team. The Meridian staff in 1s and 2s. Robbie said goodnight to Cora across the room and went. The catering manager made a quiet loop, left. Cora was at the far end, near the window overlooking the street. She turned when the catering manager exited. She saw Bex. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Bex said, "I thought counterparty counsel wanted to discuss the week 5 filing. She left 20 minutes ago," Cora said. "I know," Bex said. The private lounge had the quiet of a space that has been full and is now almost empty, furniture still arranged for a gathering, glasses not quite cleared, the building's ambient hum replacing 20 people. The street outside the window was doing what streets in the financial district do at 10 on a Friday, thinning toward the part of the night that belongs to other industries. Cora crossed the room. She stopped at the near end of the conference table, where the tombstone materials were still stacked, and looked at them. Then she looked at Bex. Bex said, "I have been watching you make no mistakes for 22 months. "I make them," Cora said. "Not visible ones. The paperwork. 3 wrong signatures on 3 consecutive pages," Bex said. "The Harlan acquisition agreement." "You were not reviewing the Hanover brief," Cora said. "The Hanover brief had been final for 5 weeks." "I know," Bex said. A silence, long, the room's ambient hum. Outside, the city moving in the particular indifferent way of cities toward anything happening inside their buildings. "I was looking at you," Cora said. The wrong line. "I was looking at you instead of the documents." The silence that came after was the specific silence of an accurate thing finally being said in a room that had been holding it for weeks. Not relieved. Not lighter. Dense with the weight of everything the sentence had been compressed into before it was allowed out, Bex said nothing for a long moment. She had prepared herself, or believed she had, for a number of versions of this conversation. She had prepared for deflection. For the professional cover story extended with another layer, for Cora to look at her with those composed eyes and say something insufficient and precisely chosen and call it enough. She had not prepared for this version, the direct sentence, no cover, no redirect, delivered to the tablecloth first, and then, slowly, to her. 3 wrong signatures, she said. The first time, I thought I'd prepared the wrong version. "I know," Cora said. The second time, I thought you were distracted. I was not distracted. The third time, Beck said, I saw where you were looking. Yes. The room did not change. Nothing in the room changed physically. And everything about the room changed, the way rooms change when the actual subject finally arrives without a cover story around it. Beck said, What does that mean? Cora looked at her. The composure was doing the most work she had ever seen it do. Not cracking. Fully present. Fully effortful, and the effort was visible in a way that nothing about this woman was usually visible. She said nothing. Beck said it again. More quietly. Not as a demand. As a real question, offered to a person she had been watching pay an enormous cost to manage an enormous thing for an enormous length of time. What does that mean? Cora looked at the table. Then she moved, toward the door. Her jacket was on a chair near the entrance, and she pulled it on with the efficiency of 20 years of practice, and the armor went back into place. She said, at the door, without turning around. Good work on the integration. The third jurisdiction submission window is the one to watch. She left. The door did not slam. It closed with the quiet, deliberate sound of heavy doors in rooms built for discretion. Beck stood in the near-empty lounge with the stacked paperwork and the not-quite-cleared glasses and the cedar trace already dissipating into the room's neutral air. She thought about 3 wrong signatures. About the pen tapping once on a desk. About the cedar in the elevator, and I know you will, and it wouldn't be appropriate for me to say. She thought, I know what this is. She thought, I am going to make her say it. Not tonight. Not here, with the armor just put back on at the door. But eventually. In a room she chose, at a time she chose, with enough space around the thing that there was nowhere left to put the cover story. She turned off the light the catering manager had left on. She collected her things. She walked out through the lobby and into the March night and thought about the distance between the wrong line and the right one and what it would take to close it, and whether the cost was the kind that felt like cost or the kind that felt like arriving somewhere you had been heading for a long time without quite knowing it. She thought it was probably both. The weekend passed, the way weekends pass, when they contain something you have decided not to examine yet. Not avoidance. Beck's was not built for avoidance, had never been, had always preferred the documented version of a situation to the approximated one. But there was a difference between not examining something and not being ready to examine it, and she was honest enough with herself to understand that she was in the second category. She knew what the thing was. She had known since October, or had known something adjacent to it, adjacent enough that knowing the whole thing now felt less like new information and more like a document finally reaching the correct signature field. She went to the office on Saturday. Not because of Cora. Because the third jurisdiction submission documentation had a gap in the regulatory timeline that had been bothering her since Tuesday, and the building was quiet on Saturdays, and the quiet made thinking cleaner. The documentation floor at 10 in the morning on a weekend had a different quality than it had at 10 on a weekday, the same physical space, the same carpet and monitor glow and view of the city at working angle, but with the ambient noise of 20 people pulled away and only the building's infrastructure left beneath it. She liked it. She had done some of her best work on Saturday mornings since she started at Meridian, which was something she had never told anyone because it sounded like the kind of thing people said about themselves to seem dedicated, and she was simply telling the truth. She worked for 4 hours. She found the gap a filing window that compressed against a response deadline in a way the initial calendar had not properly flagged. A 12-day span that the regulatory body's standard response window pushed into a single 4-day window that allowed no correction time for anything that came back with conditions. She built the corrected timeline. She documented the risk mitigation in 3 scenarios, ranging from the cleanest outcome to the one that required a continuance request and a secondary brief. She sent the updated version to the committee record and CC'd the COO. She did not CC Cora. She would have, ordinarily. She sent it without thinking about why she hadn't, and then sat with the oversight for about 45 seconds before sending a follow-up email with Cora on the distribution. She wrote the follow-up as a forward with no additional context, which was the correct professional move, and was also the move she made when she needed to not think too carefully about what she was doing. Then she went home. She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table and did not do any additional work, which was itself unusual for a Saturday in the middle of an integration cycle, and let herself think about the private lounge at the restaurant, 3 blocks from Meridian's tower, and the cedar trace already dissipating into the room's neutral air, and the quiet, deliberate sound of a heavy door closing. I was looking at you instead of the documents. She had known this, or had known something adjacent to it, since October, which was what the part of her that had been paying close attention had said in the coffee bar after the first wrong signature. Knowing it and hearing it, said aloud by the person doing the looking, were 2 different things, and she had understood the difference intellectually but had not experienced it until Friday evening in a room that smelled of the clean neutral trace of other people's dinners and the very faint cedar that followed Cora Straint, James into every closed space she occupied. The sentence had weight that the knowing had not had. It sat in her mind with the specific density of something that had been compressed for a long time and had finally been allowed its full dimensions. Cora did not say things she had not accounted for. She did not produce unguarded admissions. She had walked out of a private room after saying the most direct sentence she had managed in 6 weeks of carefully managed proximity, and she had put the armor back on at the door with the efficiency of 20 years of practice, as though the sentence could be filed somewhere. It would not require a follow-up, as though the admission was a closing document rather than an opening one. Bex thought, "She thinks that is how this works." She thought, "It is not how this works." She thought about the 3rd jurisdiction submission window and the 4-day gap in the corrected calendar, and the way the best documentation work was always the work that identified not just the error, but the moment at which the error became correctable. You could not fix a filing window after it had closed. You could not amend a document after the amendment period. The work was in the preparation in reading the timeline far enough ahead to understand where the pressure points were and addressing them before they became consequences. She thought, "I know what the timeline looks like from here." She thought, "I know exactly what I am going to do. The only question was when." Monday was normal in the way that the Monday after the first wrong signature had been normal, a surface that held its shape while the substructure ran in a different direction underneath. The integration work was in its 2nd phase. The documentation timelines were running on schedule. Bex had 3 committee subtasks in progress, the 3rd jurisdiction corrected calendar on Cora's distribution, and 4 deliverable windows in the next 2 weeks. The work was sufficient to fill the day, and she let it. Tamsin arrived at 8:23. She set down her bag, opened her monitor, went to get coffee, came back. She said nothing about the closing dinner. Bex looked at her monitor and thought, "She is not going to ask." Tamsin was not going to ask because she had been at that firm for 6 years and had the specific knowledge of someone who had watched a great many situations move through the professional landscape of Meridian Capital and had learned to understand which ones would name themselves and which ones would not, and which category this one was in had apparently been clear to her since before the dinner. Bex appreciated this. She also appreciated that Tamsin's silence was not the silence of someone who didn't know it, was the silence of someone who knew and was holding it with the professional respect it deserved. She worked. The mitigation scenarios from Saturday looked correct in daylight, which they should. She had built them correctly, but there was always a specific relief in looking at clean work the morning after, and finding it still clean. She sent the revised timeline to the full committee distribution at 9:15. At 9:47, a reply came from Cora. Reviewed. Proceed with the corrected sequence. 3 words beyond what the confirmation required. Confirmed would have been sufficient. Reviewed. Proceed with the corrected sequence was 5 additional words, and each of them was deliberate, because everything Cora produced in text or speech was deliberate. Bex read them twice, and filed the email in the project folder with the same care she would have given any committee communication. She was very professional about it. She was also thinking about them 40 minutes later, which was not strictly about the integration. At 10:15, Robbie called with a note that the Wednesday documentation review was being moved to Thursday at 2. Standard phrasing. Schedule conflict on Wednesday. Apologies for the change. Bex confirmed the change. After the call, she looked at her calendar. Thursday at 2 was a slot she had not had open at that time before. The schedule conflict was not on her calendar and was not something she had information about, which meant it was on Cora's calendar, which meant the adjustment was coming from the 32nd floor, which meant it had been arranged rather than occurring. She noted this without deciding what it meant and added the adjusted meeting to her calendar and returned to the filing sequencing work. The committee session on Tuesday ran in the way committee sessions ran in the second phase, less discovery work, more tracking and adjustment, the particular rhythm of a process that had found its operating tempo. Cora arrived on schedule. Not the 50-minute mark of the early sessions, not the deliberate on-time arrival of the week after the coffee with Presley. On schedule, the way she arrived when the session was genuinely her priority and not a performance of priority. She ran the integration checkpoint. She asked 3 technical questions, one about the documentation sequence, one about the regulatory calendar, one about the communications compliance layer, all substantive, all the correct questions. She dismissed the committee at the 1-hour mark with action items distributed and no excess. She looked at Bex once. At the 78-second mark of the filing discussion, which Bex registered the way she registered all the data she had been cataloging for 6 weeks, with the specific attention of someone who has decided they are paying attention and is following through, the look lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then Cora's gaze moved to the COO, who was speaking, and the look was filed. 2 seconds. The composure was doing what it had been doing for 6 weeks, which was to hold the weight of something that was not small, with an efficiency that looked like absence. Bex had been watching it long enough to understand the distinction. It did not look like cost because Cora was very good. It was cost. And if you had been looking long enough and closely enough, you could see the exact point where it was being maintained by decision rather than by nature. She understood something then that she had not quite put into those specific terms before. Cora was not afraid of the conversation. She was afraid of what came after it. The admission at the closing dinner had been the thing that had exceeded the management capacity not because she had lost control, but because 6 weeks of exact and deliberate sideways management had accumulated to a point past which even a very good structure could not hold. She had walked out not because she was retreating but because she had not yet worked out whether she was prepared for the implications of what came next. The difference was operational. The difference mattered. Bex looked at her action items for the week. She thought about Thursday at 2. Presley found her in the documentation office on Wednesday afternoon, at the end of a long day that had been clean and entirely about work. She knocked on the partition in the particular way she had developed for announcing herself 3 short taps, the code of someone who had established their approach and used it consistently. "Still on for tomorrow?" she asked. "Green awning, 4:15, Bex said. She was there at 4 to 10. Bex arrived at 4:13. They ordered. They sat. The espresso was what it always was, which was the reason Bex had started going there in the first place, and the company was what the company had become over several weeks of this particular end-of-day ritual, which was easy in the specific way of people who found each other professionally useful and also genuinely interesting to talk to. The first 15 minutes were about the integration, the Phase 2 procurement timeline, the file reconciliation status, whether the third jurisdiction corrected calendar was going to create any downstream issues in the communications compliance layer that Presley's side was managing. It was substantive, and they both had relevant information, and it went quickly in the way of 2 people who understood the same material. Then Presley said, without transition, "How are you doing?" It was not a committee question. The tone was different, warmer, direct, the specific quality of her attention when she was looking at you, rather than at the work. Bex looked at her espresso. She thought about the closed door at the restaurant, and the cedar trace, and the sentence that had been said, and the one that had not been answered. "I am working something out," she said. Presley said, "The integration?" "Not the integration." A pause. The coffee bar had its afternoon texture, the machine running on its automatic cycle, two conversations at the other end of the space, the sound of the street through the open door. Presley had the quality Bex had come to understand over the weeks of this arrangement, which was that she did not fill silences she had not filled. She asked things and then she waited, and the waiting was not impatient and was not a signal that the question needed a particular answer. It was simply, "I asked." "Take the time you need," Presley said. "I noticed the third look at the dinner." Bex said nothing. "She means I noticed it too." The full sentence came through in Presley's tone without being completed aloud. "I noticed what it was, and what came before it and after it, and I am not going to do anything with having noticed except tell you I did." Bex looked at her. Presley said, "I have been doing M&A advisory work for 6 years. I have been in a lot of rooms with people who are very good at managing what they show. What I have learned is that the ones who are best at it, the real best, the ones who have been doing it for 15 or 20 years, those are the ones for whom managing it costs the most. Because they understand exactly what they are containing. The cost is in the understanding. The more precisely you understand something, the more precisely you have to manage it," Bex said. She walked out. "I know. I saw her. That was 4 days ago," Bex said. Presley turned her espresso cup in the saucer in the small way she had, a habit Bex had noticed across several sessions. Then she said, "When I was a second-year analyst, my mentor told me that the hardest deal to close is not the one where the other party wants different terms. It's the one where the other party wants the same terms but is afraid to say so. Because if they want different terms, you negotiate toward the middle. But if they want the same terms, you can't negotiate. You have to find the thing that is making them hesitate and address it directly, because the hesitation is not about the deal. It is about something adjacent to the deal. And if you address the deal, you miss the thing." Bex thought about this. About the Hanover brief that had been final for 5 weeks, assembled with the precision of someone who understood that the truth required more of the other person than the cover story was willing to ask. About the committee assignment that came through Daria's office. About the weekly updates and the scheduled meetings that ran on real work and were also asking something the real work was not allowed to ask. She said, quietly, to the table rather than to Presley, "What is she hesitating about?" Presley said, "I think she is not sure what it asks of you. She knows what it asks of her. She has worked out the cost on her side, which is considerable, and she has decided she can carry it. She has been carrying it for a year by the look of it. What she has not worked out is whether she has the right to put any of that cost on you, whether it is appropriate to ask." Beck sat with that for a moment. It landed differently than she expected. Not sideways, directly, the way Presley's things often landed, and it changed the shape of something she had been looking at from the wrong angle. Not self-protection. Not fear of the conversation, fear of the imposition. The cover story assembled to protect the other person from being asked something the other person had not been given the choice to refuse. The oversight was in the math. The cover story was what you constructed when you had decided, without asking, that the answer was probably no. She said, "The third jurisdiction submission window is the one to watch." Presley looked at her without asking what that meant. She said, "That sounds like a plan." "It is," Beck said. They finished their espresso. They walked back toward the building in the late afternoon, the March air doing its transitional work around them, the financial district at the end of its business day, moving in the particular way it moved, when the decision-makers were still working, and the support layers were beginning to think about dinner. Presley said goodnight at the building entrance and went in the direction of the advisory firm's space. Bex went in the direction of the elevator bank and thought about Thursday at 2. She had prepared the third jurisdiction corrected timeline 4 times by Thursday morning. Not because it needed 4 passes, it had been correct after the second, and the third pass had added a refinement to the secondary risk scenario that was genuinely useful, and the 4th pass had not improved anything, and she knew it and had done it anyway, because the work settled her, and she had decided, with the precision she brought to anything she decided with precision, what she was going to do at 2 o'clock, and she preferred to arrive settled. The documentation was correct. The risk scenarios were complete. The corrected filing sequence resolved the compression gap and provided a 3-day buffer on the response window that did not exist in the original calendar, which was itself the kind of clean resolution that the integration committee was going to benefit from, regardless of anything else that happened today. The work stood on its own. She wanted it to stand on its own. She wanted the professional portion of the meeting to be exactly what it was: substantive, complete, the product of someone who was very good at her work, and what came after the professional portion to be exactly what that was too. She arrived at Robbie's desk at 2 o'clock on the 2nd. He looked up and waved her through immediately, which was itself data, not the brief wait while he announced her, not the standard protocol. Immediately, which meant the slot was clear and had been kept clear, and Cora had told him to send her through. Cora was at the window when Bex came in, profile to the glass, the tablet in her hand, reviewing something with the focused stillness of a person who was genuinely working and not performing working. She turned when she heard the door, immediately. The same departure from her standard practice that had registered on the first delivery, the finished thought-first approach she took with everyone else, abandoned again, the second time Bex had watched it be abandoned in this office. Bex crossed to the desk. She set the documentation portfolio on the polished surface. The third jurisdiction timeline, she said. I have reworked the regulatory sequence. There was a compression gap in the original calendar, a 12-day filing window that pressed against the regulatory body's standard response period. I have corrected it and built 3 risk scenarios for the remaining variants. Cora came to the desk. She looked at the portfolio. She did not pick up her pen. Walk me through it, she said. Bex laid out the documents and walked through the corrected sequence. The filing window, the response deadline, the 3-day buffer, and how it had been created within the existing regulatory framework without requiring a continuance request. The 3 risk scenarios, the clean outcome, the conditioned response outcome requiring secondary documentation, and the outlier scenario requiring a full continuance, which was the scenario she had built even though it was unlikely because the work was in accounting for every scenario including the unlikely ones. She was precise and thorough and completely in command of the material. Cora asked 2 questions, both substantive. The first about the secondary documentation required in the conditioned response scenario. The second about the jurisdictional interaction between the third submission and the primary regulatory calendar, a question that required understanding both filing sequences simultaneously, which Cora had, clearly, been tracking independently because the question reflected a more complete picture of the full regulatory environment than most of the committee possessed. Bex answered both questions fully. When the second answer landed, Cora said, "That is a clean resolution. The committee needed this." "I will update the record," Bex said. "I have a question." Cora looked at her. She said, "Not about the documents. The room was the room it had always been. The carpet and the glass and the view that extended past the financial district toward the harbor on clear days, the tablet on the desk, the framed photograph in the far corner, small against the window glass. The cedar and paper and conditioned air smell she knew now at 4 distances, and at this distance standing at the desk with the portfolio between them, she was in the range where it was present without being definite, the closest it got before it became the elevator version of itself." Cora said, "That is not a professional question." "No," Bex said, "it isn't." A pause. Something moved through the composed expression, not breaking it. Moving behind it, the way water moves behind glass without disturbing the surface, Cora said, carefully, "What is the question?" Bex said, "You have been asking me something sideways for 6 weeks. Since the first document delivery. I think it started before that the committee assignment, the specific timing of every meeting that appeared on my calendar, with enough margin around it for something other than work, but from the delivery forward, it was every week. You asked it through the correction meeting on Saturday. You asked it through the committee assignment and through the weekly updates and through the meetings that ran on real work and were also asking something the work could not directly ask. You said one sentence in the restaurant on Friday evening and then walked out before the sentence had an answer." She looked at Cora. I am not giving you another 6 weeks of sideways, she said. I would like a direct answer. And I would like to ask the direct question first, so that you know what you are answering. The composure was doing what she had been watching it do for months, the full structural load of something not small being held by will and practice, and the particular discipline of someone who had been doing this work, all of it, for a very long time. Not cracking, not releasing, held. What, Cora said, is the direct question. Bex said, what does it mean that you were looking at me instead of the documents? The answer did not come immediately. Cora turned. Not away from Bex entirely, not the avoidance of someone who did not want the question. Toward the window, the same position she occupied when she was thinking carefully, when the view was the thing her eyes went to, while the rest of her worked on something that required full attention. She stood there for a moment with the tablet against her chest and the platinum watch catching the afternoon light the way it always did from this distance, a small bright thing on her right wrist that had been in the same place for what looked like a very long time. She said, without turning around. I have been in this industry for 19 years. For most of those years, I have been in a position of some authority. I understand what that authority asks of the people around me, and what behavior is appropriate, and what isn't. I have managed those boundaries consistently because I understood from early in my career that they exist for reasons that are not arbitrary. Bex said nothing. Cora continued. What I have not had, in 19 years, is a situation that did not respond to the management framework I applied to every other situation. Every problem I have encountered in this career has yielded to structure. To the correct application of appropriate distance, correct procedure, appropriate professional behavior maintained with enough consistency and enough discipline that the thing under management remained managed. I have managed everything this way. She paused. The afternoon light was moving the way it moved at this hour, the particular gold of a March afternoon 3 days into what felt like spring. This has not responded to that. Bex said. No, it hasn't. Cora turned. She looked at Bex across the room. There were approximately 8 feet between them and the desk between them, and the afternoon coming through the glass, and 19 years of managing things correctly on one side, and 22 months of watching from a careful distance on the other. She said, I have been aware of you since October of last year, not professionally or not only professionally. Since the Castellan transaction debrief, you identified a filing error in counterparty's submission in the first 40 minutes of a review that 3 senior attorneys had not caught in 2 days. I was aware of the work before that. After that, I was aware of you in a different way. October, Bex thought. The same month. The part of her that had been paying close attention said, with the tone of someone who had been correct for a long time. I know, Cora said. I managed it. Correctly and consistently. For 5 months, I maintained exactly the appropriate professional behavior that the situation required. You were a junior member of my documentation team, and I interacted with you as a junior member of my documentation team, with exactly the level of attention and access that was appropriate to that relationship, and I understood that to be what was correct. Bex said. Until the signature package. Cora looked at her. Until the signature package. A pause. She said, I signed 3 consecutive pages in the wrong place because I was looking at you. I understood, on the second page, that this was what I was doing. I signed the second page in the wrong place with full awareness that I was doing so, which is the version of events that I have not previously stated aloud, and which I am stating now, because you asked a direct question, and I said I would give a direct answer. The honesty of it, the specific, forensic honesty of it, the same quality she brought to everything, turned toward this was different from what Bex had expected. Not because she had expected deflection, but because the precision of it was Cora's precision, applied to the thing she had been most carefully managing, and it had a different quality than the precision in a boardroom or a committee session or a document review. It was the most exposed thing she had heard her say. She said, and the Hanover brief. Cora said. The Hanover brief had been final for 5 weeks. It had, Bex said. Cora said. I constructed a cover story. I understood at the time that it would not hold under scrutiny, and I produced it anyway because the alternative was stating the thing directly, and I had not determined whether I had the right to state it. whether stating it asked something of you that you had not chosen to be asked. Bex held this for a moment. There it was. Not self-protection. The math she had not finished until the coffee with Presley. The cover story assembled not to protect the cover story, but to protect her. She said, "That is a significant miscalculation." Cora said, "I know that now." She looked at Bex with the full composed gaze, and the composure held everything it was holding and cost what it cost, and Bex understood looking at her that this was not distance. This was the most available she had ever been in a room with anyone, and the composure was what remained when the cover story was gone. Bex said, "I have been aware of you for longer than I am professionally comfortable admitting. The part of me that has been paying close attention to this has been paying attention since October. I wore the blazer the first time I came to this office because the 32nd floor is cold, and I learned it after the first visit. I have noted the platinum watch. I know the difference between your working hand and your presentation hand. I have been in close enough proximity to you to know what this office smells like, and what you smell like, and the difference between those two things. And I have known that difference since before the wrong signatures." She looked at Cora. "What I want you to understand," she said, "is that I have wanted the direct answer from the beginning. I have not been managing this. I have been waiting for you to stop." The room held what had been said. A silence that was different from every silence that had preceded it in every room they had occupied together. Not the tense silence of something being managed, not the careful silence of a cover story being assembled. The silence of a space from which every layer of management has been removed, and what remains is the thing itself, standing in the afternoon light without anything around it. Cora crossed the room. Not quickly. Not with the optimized efficiency of her usual movement through every space she occupied in this building. Each step, deliberate. Unhurried the way she was unhurried about everything, except that this was a different kind of unhurried, not time being managed correctly, but time being given its proper weight. She stopped at a distance that was not desk distance, and not far. The cedar was definite here, real and specific. The closest Bex had been to it outside the sealed economy of the executive elevator. She said, "I need you to understand that I am not certain what the correct procedure is from here." Bex said, "There is no procedure." Cora looked at her. The compression at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile happened then, the small, contained version of an expression that wanted more room than it was given. It was the most unguarded thing Bex had seen on her face in 22 months, and it was barely visible, and it was completely real. She said, "That is not a common framework for this firm." Bex said, "I think we can manage it." The watch on Cora's right wrist caught the afternoon light once more. Old, possibly inherited. The kind of object that carried history in its weight, which was a thing Bex had known about it since the first time she had been close enough to see it clearly and had never said to anyone. She said, "The photograph. In the far corner. I have been close enough to see it twice and I have never asked." Cora turned slightly toward the corner. The frame was small against the window glass, positioned where the afternoon light fell across it at this hour. "My mother," she said, "at 40. She worked in finance." "That explains some things," Bex said. Cora looked at her. "Yes," she said. "I imagine it does." The afternoon moved through the glass between them, and the room was what it was. The carpet, and the view, and the cedar, and the document portfolio on the polished desk with the corrected filing sequence and the 3 risk scenarios, all of them accounted for. The work finished and standing correctly on its own, and the particular quality of the room had changed in the way rooms change when the thing that has been in them without a name finally has one. Bex said, "The committee ends in 3 weeks." Cora said, "I know." "After the committee," Bex said, "what is the appropriate procedure?" Cora was quiet for a moment. The composure was present, but carrying something different now, not the weight of containment, something more deliberate, something that was choosing to take its time rather than being forced to. She said, "There is no appropriate procedure for this. There is only what we choose to do carefully and with full understanding of what we're choosing." The full understanding includes the professional context and the position differential and the fact that I am the CEO of this firm, and nothing about that changes regardless of what this is. Beck said, I understand what I am choosing. The position differential is not new information. Neither is anything else you have said about the context. Cora looked at her. The something that had been moving behind the composure all through this conversation was closer to the surface now. Not breaking through. Present. She said, You are 26 years old. Yes, Beck said. Cora said. I was not, at 26, prepared for the thing I was choosing at 26. I understand that is not a universal statement. No, Beck said. It isn't. Cora said, I am telling you what I know of the cost of this kind of thing in this kind of context. I am telling you because you deserve to know it before you tell me you have already decided. Beck said, I know the cost. A pause. She said, I have been tracking the cost since October. I know the configuration. I know what it means that the committee assignment went through Daria's office, and not directly. I know what it means that every meeting has had work in it that was real, and also something the work was not allowed to directly ask. I know what the Hanover brief cost you to produce, which is more than the actual cost of a cover story because you are the person who produced it, and I know how much precision you put into the things you are least comfortable saying. She held Cora's gaze. I know what I am choosing, she said. I chose it in October. I have been waiting for you. The room was quiet around them. The afternoon light had moved another degree through the glass, the harbor visible in the distance on a clear day, the March sky the particular blue of a season finally becoming what it had been moving toward. Cora said, So do I. 2 words. The specific weight of a decision, made with full understanding of the decision. She reached out then and did the thing she had not done in 19 years of managing things correctly. She stopped managing. Her hand covered Bex's where it rested on the edge of the desk, not tightly, not with the force of something long withheld, steadily. The way you hold something you intend to hold carefully. She said, I am going to be very careful with this. Beck said, I know. She said, That is not a small thing. I know, Beck said. That is why I waited. The watch was warm from her wrist. Bex was aware of it at this distance without looking at it, the same way she had been aware of the cedar at 4 different distances over 22 months, cataloging the approach by increments. This was the closest. This was the threshold of all the distances she had been noting, she said, quietly. The distance between the wrong line and the right one. Cora said, Yes. She did not move yet. Neither of them did. The afternoon held the minute for a long moment, the kind of long moment that earns its length because it is the moment on the other side of something, and the something was not small. Then Cora said, You should go back to your floor. Beck said, I know. She did not move immediately, Cora said. With the compression at the corner of her mouth that was the small contained version of something that wanted more room. Go. Bex collected the portfolio from the desk. She put the documents in order, the corrected filing sequence, the risk scenarios, the buffer calendar. She did this with the care she brought to everything she prepared, which was considerable, because the care was not for show, and she had never done it for show. She said, The 3rd jurisdiction submission window. 3 days of buffer in the corrected calendar. Cora said, I see it. Beck said, It should be enough. She looked at Cora when she said it. At the composed face and the platinum watch and the afternoon light and the 14 years in careful language and 5 years in this office and 22 months of a distance that was now a different kind of distance. Cora said, Yes, I think it will be. She left the office at 4:12. Robbie was at his desk. He looked at the portfolio full, the documentation in order, and said, Have a good evening, Miss Okafor. You too, Robbie. Beck said. She rode the elevator down. The executive bank with its quieter mechanism and its controlled drop and the ceiling light that went softer in the evenings. 32. 31. 30. 29. At 28 the door opened. She stepped out into the documentation wing. Tamsin was at her desk. End-of-day work spread before her, the monitor with 3 open windows, the end of the coffee that had been sitting there since 3. She looked up when Bex came through the door. She looked at Bex with the particular attention of someone who had been at this firm for 6 years and had watched a great many things move through its professional landscape and had learned, in 6 years, to understand the shape of things without requiring them to be named. Then she turned back to her monitor. Bex sat at her desk. She looked at the updated filing calendar for the 3rd jurisdiction submissions corrected, buffered, complete. She looked at the committee record. She looked at the email from Monday, reviewed. Proceed with the corrected sequence. She thought about October. About a debrief on the Castellan transaction and 40 minutes and a filing error that 3 senior attorneys had not found in 2 days. About 5 months of correct professional distance and 3 wrong signatures and a cover story built with the precision of someone who understood that the truth asked something of the other person and who had decided, without asking, that the other person had not been given the right to refuse. About a kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon, and the weight of a sentence finally allowed its full dimensions. She thought about a hand placed steadily on hers in the afternoon light, with the care of someone who intended to hold something carefully. About the harbor visible on a clear day from the 32nd floor. About the photograph in the far corner. And my mother, at 40, and the things that explained, and the things that didn't need to be explained. She thought, 3 wrong signatures. She thought, the distance between the wrong line and the right one. She thought, 3 days of buffer in the corrected calendar. It should be enough. The building moved around her into its evening configuration. The cleaning staff ascending through the floors, the lights finding their dimmed settings, the ambient sound of 20 people thinning to 10, and then to fewer. Tamsin packed her bag at 5:17 and said goodnight in the tone that meant, I am not asking anything, and also I am aware of everything. Bex said goodnight and meant it. She stayed until 5:45. She finished the 2 tasks she had left open. She sent the committee record update to the full distribution, filed the corrected timeline in the project folder, closed her files. She logged off her machine with the specific care of someone who did the closing procedures correctly every time, which she did, because she was meticulous and had always been meticulous, and that was not going to change. She collected her things. She took the elevator. In the lobby, the building's evening current moved around her the last people of the workday, the glass walls catching the late March light at the angle that made the interior look briefly like something other than its daily self. The revolving door was still in motion when she stepped through it. The air outside was March in its last ambivalence, cold underneath and something else above it, the specific texture of a season that had been making its decision for weeks and had finally made it. She stood on the sidewalk. The financial district moved in its evening way. She thought about October and the pattern and the document delivered on a Thursday in March, and the 3 wrong signatures and the 6 weeks of sideways questions and the private room at the restaurant, and a sentence finally said, without a cover story around it. She thought about the thing that had been moving toward a point for a long time, and the point it had arrived at this afternoon, and the particular quality of a room from which all management has been removed. She thought, it is going to require careful management. She thought, she is going to be very good at it. She turned toward the subway. She walked through the March evening, through the financial district in its closing hour, through the particular light of a season finally becoming what it had always been moving toward. She thought about the distance between the wrong line and the right one, and what it took to close it, and the answer to that question which she now had. She thought, I know you will. She thought, so do I.